Welcome to Raisina Ideas Pod with Firstpost. We're going to be discussing developments in Europe, and I have two very distinguished gentlemen with me. I have Mr. Attila Demkó, who is the head of the Strategic Foresight Program at the George Lukacs Institute in Hungary, and I have Mr. Gladden Pappin, who's president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Hungary, of course, has broken some of the old consensus, in a manner of speaking, in Europe, and their prime minister has taken some very forthright stance. Not made him the most popular guy, but I suppose people need to speak some home truths, and we'll probably discuss some of those today. So, Attila, my first question is to you. Over the last 15-20 years, we've seen a lot of wokeness in Europe, and very often from, sitting in, say, India, it seems Europe might be losing its strategic relevance. Do you think that is really the case because of, this growing conflict between a very woke kind of an ideology which seems to have taken over Europe, where Europe, we feel, is unable to take care of its own interests, protect its own interests, and of course the kind of posturing Europe does in the rest of the world. There seems to be a mismatch. How do you look at it?
Indeed, there are problems in Europe, economic problems, internal issues within countries, between countries, disagreements, and part of it is because of this ideological approach to internal policy, but also external policy. I think Europe is trying to punch above its weight. We should be more realistic. Europe is not the center of the world anymore. Actually, Asia is becoming the center of the world, and of course the United States is staying as a superpower. But Europe is not a superpower anymore, and we still talk to people, like people in India, like we have the moral high ground, like we know more, we see farther, we are bigger. We are not. And that's what I think Hungary is saying, that we have to be realistic. We shouldn't push our agenda, especially not to the outside world. What we think about the world as common values, not necessarily the values of Indians, 1.4 billion people. We are 450 million people in the European Union. So we should be realistic. And also within European societies, because this weakens Europe. If we have debates, such debates on migration, and migration is not a success story in Europe. There are a lot of conflicts in several major Western European countries. So if we continue like this, we are losing the outside world, and we are losing large parts of our societies, of our own societies. So we have to work on that. I definitely see a strategic slide in Europe, not only in economy, but also in our outreach. Our Indians are listening more to Europe than 20 years ago. I don't think so. They listen to us less. They respect Europe less than before. And I think much of it is for own making. So we have to change that.
So, Gladden, what we've seen happen in Europe is that, Attila talks about the migration crisis. Multiculturalism doesn't seem to have succeeded. In fact, when we see the kind of pressures which are coming into Europe, demands for Sharia rule in parts of Europe, and European states not able to push back. In fact, they seem to be diffident, they seem to be defensive, they seem to be almost apologetic. And it seems that they're in a kind of a self-destruct mode because they're not protecting the values which they espouse. Sitting in the US and you look at Europe, which has been a very close ally of the United States, how do you measure up Europe these days?
Well, I think you're right to point out these problems, and let's talk about the reasons why Europe has been acting in the way that it has. For much of the last 50 years, really in the post-World War II era as a whole, nationalism was identified by many people as the major cause of wars. And so international structures were built in order to mitigate the power of nations and nationalism. But what we're seeing now, particularly when you look at Europe, you see these surveys where people are asked, would you fight for your country in a war? Would you give your life for your country if it were invaded? And the numbers are very sobering. They're low. And if we actually want to have a secure world, a world in which nations can get along peacefully, at this point we need a resurgence of national identity, not in a revanchist way, not in an aggressive and warmongering way, but as a basis for one's civic identity. And that's going to come back. It already is coming back. The problem is that many European leaders are still trying to mitigate that. They're still trying to prevent it. They're trying to keep nationalist voices or pro-national sovereignty voices out of the public discourse. They're trying to limit the role that those political parties play in public life. And it's becoming a self-undermining thing. We can talk about security all we want, but as Vice President J.D. Vance asked at the Munich Security Conference, what is it for? What are we securing? And until European nations can, again, give an answer to that, of course, some of them can, Hungary certainly can, but until they can all give an answer to that and also allow these more patriotic voices to rise and to have a presence in the public discourse, then Europe will continue on this sideways and even downward path.
Yeah, so but what we are seeing happen in Europe is the kind of polarization which, for example, we've seen in the United States, we've seen in India, we've seen in some other countries, where some of these voices have emerged and are pushing back against what was the erstwhile dominant narrative, doubling down on national identity and stuff like that. We've seen that starting to happen in Europe. We've seen that in the Netherlands. We've seen that in Hungary, of course. We've seen it in Germany right now, the resurgence with the AfD. We've seen it in France. We've seen it in the UK. Where do you think politics is going now? Is it moving completely to the right, or is this some kind of a correction coming in to the kind of wokeness and ultra-liberal, I would even call it loony liberal kind of stuff which are starting to happen? Is it that kind of a shift taking place, or is it just a correction taking place?
Well, there is definitely a correction, but the world has also changed. What Gladden said is absolutely true. We are living in a much more dangerous world. If you are teaching our sons that your homeland is not important, how you expect to defend it for them? I mean, for a 20-year-old, if he's listening that your history is just bad, your identity is not important, you are European or you are a global citizen, then how will we defend ourselves? And of course, we are living in a dangerous world. So, yes, there is a correction. I think this woke revolution went way too far, and there is a backlash. But also there are facts on the ground. There is a big war next to us, Russian aggression against Ukraine, and there is terrorism within Europe. So people see it and feel it on their own skin, that something is not good. So I think it's both. I think there's too much push from one side, but also the world has changed, and we have to recover some lost values to be able to defend ourselves.
Do you see a kind of a dividing line between the erstwhile Eastern Europe, which was under the Soviet influence, and the Western Europe? Because we see the attitudes in the Eastern part very different from what it was in the Western part. Now, they're all part of the EU, or most of them are. How does that dynamic play out within the EU now? Because earlier, it was a similar kind of an ideological framework within which EU was operating. We've seen in the German elections, if you look at the results, the AfD really scores big in what was the former GDR. Similarly, in many of the other countries. And maybe I'm wrong, but I see that within the Eastern part, which was under Soviet domination, and the Western part, there seems to be, that divide which is there. So how does Europe now deal with this?
Well, born and raised in the United States, so I can only analyze as an analyst when considering the deep structural aspects of that, particularly within Central and Eastern Europe. But I think one thing that happened is that during the Cold War, there were all sorts of social processes that were going on in the West. There was a liberalization of mores, a more progressive interpretation of sex and things like that. And so the culture became more liberal. But at the end of the Cold War, what happened is that the Western leaders said, these are the reasons that we won, and therefore we want to take these more radical values that have developed and export them everywhere. If we look at that as a package, there are some aspects of it that are good. Of course, we want to have societies that are based on the rule of law. We want to have elections. India is the largest democracy. All these things are important. But there was like an extra layer of that which really went too far. And I think what happened in Central and Eastern Europe, at least from those who lived through the Soviet times and emerged after it, many people initially wanted to adopt everything from the West, but over time they saw that the package that was being offered included a lot of pretty crazy stuff. And that stuff went too far. Now there's been a reaction against it. So you can see that a little bit in the, for example, you pointed to the map of the most recent German parliamentary elections, which showed the AfD very strong in the East. But I think that there's still a reservoir of common sense and everyday values that's fully modern and in favor of freedom, but not some of these excesses and, as you put it, Looney Tunes liberalism that we've seen grow up over time. And it's really important to step back from that. It's really important to just get back to normal. Why is the U.S. Army recruitment numbers going up so rapidly even at the beginning of the Trump administration? The same thing happened there. Even the American military went too far in the woke direction. Ordinary people stopped wanting to join it. So everyone just needs to pull back from that and get back to good common sense, everyday values. That's something that was maintained in Central and Eastern Europe. That's why you see it reflected at the political level too.
Okay, before I go back to Attila, let me ask you this, because you're from the US. We've seen some pretty straight talk happen from the American side on Europe.
Yeah.
On not just J.D. Vance, but I think President Trump himself has been saying certain stuff, basically asking the Europeans to start paying their bills. How does the American-European relationship proceed from here on? Is the American administration or the Trump administration trying to knock some sense into the Europeans to wake up, and get out of the kind of stupor they've been in, that America is there to pull all their chestnuts out of the fire? Is it about that? Or does it signify something even more fundamental in how Europe and the United States will relate with each other?
Well, the fundamentals of the relationship, I think, are strong. After all, it is a shared civilization in which Europe gave birth to many of the ideas that ultimately even formed the government and society in the United States. So really nothing can change that. But beyond that, a lot can change and a lot of things need to change. As of a year ago, things were looking, in my opinion, pretty bad for the West as a whole, for the United States and for Europe. There was an ideology that we've been talking about that was very strong on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think it was becoming unsustainable. It was like an unsustainable version of liberalism. And, well, America has been the first to reinvent itself again. So America has reinvented itself. It wants to pull back from those things that we were talking about and compete better in this new emergent multipolar age. The question is whether the European liberal leaders will also adjust. Now, already it's clear that they recognize their need to improve their defense spending. This ideological level, that still has to change. So the Trump administration, in my reading, has been giving tough love to the European leaders and to the leaders of the European Union. It's not tearing up all of the values that go into the Western civilization. It's not tearing up the whole transatlantic relationship. Far from it. Things were unsustainable. It has to be reinvented, and that's why tough love, I think, from the U.S. side is a good first step.
Attila, not just as a Hungarian, but as a European, what is the great threat to Europe right now? Is it Russia, or is it your own internal weaknesses which seem to be developing? Across the continent, we are seeing the kind of new forces which are emerging. We are seeing that countries are not even able to enforce their own rules. We used to hear about two-tier policing in third world countries, but we are seeing two-tier policing in Europe. We are seeing a level of political correctness which we never thought would ever happen. You know, it's nice to be polite, but to be politically correct to a point where it becomes disastrous is something which we are seeing happen in Europe. So what is really eating up the vitals of European society? Is it what is happening internally in these countries and their inability to fix their politics, or is it the Russia threat? Or is the Russia threat might be real up to an extent, or is it also a red herring of sorts? Because you don't want to address the burning questions internally, so you know everything becomes Russia, Russia, Russia.
Yeah, it's easy to say Russia, 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 but Russia has an economy 10 times smaller than the European economy. Russia has 150 million people at most. European Union has 450 million people. What we didn't do for 20 years, spending on the military. If you don't spend, you don't have large and strong militaries. Major European states have 200 tanks, main battle tanks each. Russia have 3,000-4,000, even after losing so many in Ukraine. Russia is one problem. We have another problem on the Mediterranean. Very unstable countries, starting from Libya, which I think it was a mistake to attack back by the NATO mission, to Syria, which is again in deep trouble, Iraq, which is not that stable. We have big problem with Iran. So it's not only Russia. We have a unstable eastern border and a very unstable southern border. Both are very unstable. So I think we have the means, we have the money, we have the economic resources. So we have to rearm Europe, both mentally and in reality with hardware.
But do you have the stomach for a fight?
Well, it's a good question. You know, Europe is quite big, not as big as India by population, but I think on the east, yes. So we are different. We are different on the east. I think Poland is a very good example. They are rearming themselves, very strong army. Finland is a great example. I think the Baltic states are doing quite a lot. Hungary is doing quite a lot. We are building 6 factories which will produce military hardware, or some of them are already producing. So if you compare Hungary, which is a country of 10 million, we do much more than Germany, which is a country of more than 80 million. I mean, comparatively, comparing the size of the economy and the population. They are not building 60 factories right now. They are doing some things, and they are, you know, I think there are good moves with the new government in Germany, but it's too little, too late. So actually, Europe is not one. As Gladden said, let's say former communist Europe, former occupied Europe, because we were occupied by the Soviet Union. We were not happy allies of the Soviet Union. Our relationship was not as good as the Indian-Soviet relationship. We were occupied by them. So we remember those times. We are much more alert, not only because of Russia, because of also migration, but because that's a threat. I mean, look at the French army. They have to keep troops on their own soil to patrol the streets. So those French soldiers who are on the streets of Marseille, they are not in Estonia, they are not in Latvia, they are not defending France. So that's the problem. It's not one problem. This Russia, it's easy. It's very easy politically, this is very fashionable, but we have a lot of problems. And what America is doing, forcing us finally to spend money. Actually, the first Trump administration was very useful for Europe. Some countries woke up listening to President Trump at the time. And, you know, he's using tough language, sometimes even rude language. But we have to wake up. Since we spent much less than the 2% we promised in 2014, in 2025, there are, one more word. Spain and Italy are among the biggest members, and they are not spending even 1.5% on defense.
So before I go back to Gladden, if you are going to raise your defense spending to, say, the 5% point, from, say, about 2.5%, or even less, 5, even if you do it over a couple of years, you will have to divert money from the normal kind of, you know, social welfare schemes which are very popular in Europe. What is going to be the political impact of that?
Well, you know, if somebody says Russia, then of course you have to change your internal policies. Social policy in Germany is so generous that many people simply doesn't work. They do not work. Why? Because they get the money for life. And you have to change this. You have to change unemployment benefits, social benefits, health leave, a lot of things to change in Germany, France, many other countries. It's their choice. What we are doing in Hungary, you have 3 months unemployment benefit and it's very low. So you have to work. Well, we are a good example. We are ready to help Germany.
Right. So, Gladden, last question. I've looked at the United States. People in the US work really hard. They start early, work till late. And I look at Europe. Frankly, I'd love to be a European and live the comfortable life. But can Europe afford that kind of lifestyle anymore? Because they're not competitive anymore. They're not efficient anymore. If you want a phone connection now, it would probably have to wait for a week. You want a bank account, you probably have to wait even longer. It's crazy the way Europe works, and it's supposed to be an economic powerhouse. Do you think it can stay like that if they do not bring in necessary reforms, some of which Attila just spoke about?
Well, you're right, and actually there is something that Europe is still very good at, which is manufacturing. It's a very important manufacturing center, whereas actually the United States has lost a lot of its manufacturing. That's part of the origin of Trump, is that a lot of factories had moved to China. The U.S. economy became very financial. You can have really big asset values. You have these extraordinarily expensive companies. But Europe and the U.S. still need one another. They can trade in these areas. The U.S. can sell its high-tech services to European countries, and a lot of European manufacturing is exported to the United States. So, but you're right that there's a problem here. It's not just about reforming the inside of the European institutions. Most of the existing EU leaders would prefer to say that, well, in order to solve these problems, you have to give away more of your national sovereignty to Brussels. But the problem is that at the strategic level, the problem is in the head, as it were. What is the strategic vision for Europe in the next 5 or 10 years? This crop of EU leaders have not really been asking that question. They've been making decisions on autopilot and haven't really thought about that. So before we give them another opportunity to amass more cross-EU regulatory power in Brussels, we need to have this conversation about in what areas Europe can be more competitive in the next 5 years, and what are the conditions for that, and then do it. There's been a meme going around in the last year pointing out that Elon Musk, as representing America, somehow is able to land a rocket in reverse, whereas the European Union regulation has created the bottle cap that won't be detached from the bottle. And this is a joke, but there's a reality behind that. And the issues that you raise are important, but what's really lacking to me as a student of strategy and a participant in those international discussions, you have to decide the goals and then formulate the strategy, not the reverse. And that conversation is what really needs to be reset in Europe.
Last question, same question to both of you, 10 seconds each. Can the EU reform and reform in a way that it actually, starts working for the European people rather than for the bureaucracies?
The weaker we are, the weaker we are. We have to realize that, and if we realize that, we can reform.
Gladden?
There is a new party grouping in the European Parliament, which is the Patriots for Europe group. These parties have, in many cases, been excluded from public discourse in their countries by the mainstream as representing too extreme of an alternative. That's, for the most part, not the case. So in order for the EU institutions to reform, I think we have to allow this discussion. That's why the US has been emphasizing the importance of freedom of speech, because in Europe there has been a kind of clampdown in recent years regarding discussion of precisely these matters. So open the airwaves again, allow everyone to debate what the strategy is that European leaders should choose next, and then I think we'll see that same ability to reinvent come in Europe as well.
Or you could always come to Raisina Dialogue and discuss it openly. Thanks a lot.
Here we are.
Thanks a lot.